How did you find yourself at this point in your career where you are the leading advocate for the tapering of psychiatric medicines in an industry which I think the general public strongly associates with the use or even overuse of meds such as SSRIs as a primary tool for treatment?
Yeah. So, um, wow, where to start with this one? So, what I want people to know about me is I started off as establishment. I went to med school. I learned medicine. Then I went into psychiatry with eyes wide open, just ready to be convinced and to learn from others about how to treat mental health problems. I would say I probably had a bias towards thinking that anxiety and depression most of the time are due to life stresses, big things like relationships, sense of meaning and purpose, physical health type of issues. And so I was expecting that. But what happened when I went into my residency for psychiatry, I discovered that it was very much not what I had been expecting. I thought maybe I would be using medications occasionally, when all other means hadn't worked. But mainly I would be this kind of quarterback helping people with their relationships, send them to that professional, help them with sense of meaning, purpose, careers. They'd go to people who help them with their jobs. And then for a select few, would use the drugs. Now, what I saw when I got to residency kind of baffled me because it was just this sort of turnstile medicine, which I was observing. I was watching people come in, doctors have 20-minute appointments with them, write them a script, very, very surface level conversations. Hey, how's your depression going? What are your symptoms like? Oh, you're still having quite a lot of symptoms. Do you want to go up on the dose? That type of thing, very med focused. And to me, I was just thinking, this doesn't really make sense to me. What are we really doing here? Shouldn't we be trying to understand their lives a little bit more? And so that was like the initial impression. And yeah, I would talk to my professors about this, and they'd say, well, yes, all of the, the life and the relational stuff, that's important. The diet stuff is important, but these people, they're suffering from something else. They likely have a chemical imbalance. They have something that's wrong with them, and that's why we need to use the medications. And so, yeah, those things really weren't emphasized. And I said, okay, well, sure, but the more I sat there, the more I realized that that wasn't the case, because I would be talking to people who had anxiety and depression, and this stuff wasn't coming out of nowhere. I mean, like 99% of people had lives that were incredibly stressful, and would have made anyone unhappy. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't finding this kind of unicorn patient where it's just like, oh, from the moment I came out of the womb, I've been suffering from depression, and yes, everyone had helped me with like therapy and lifestyle modification and helping me find my sense of purpose and meaning. Typically, the story I would get was, oh, I moved and I got depressed, or, this terrible trauma happened to me in my childhood, or I went through a divorce and my PCP kind of just, they didn't really know what to do. And they put me on this. And then now I'm here in this psychiatry clinic because it's getting a little bit more complicated than that. That was like the story. And so this whole like narrative that there was this, mysterious kind of brain illness that was coming out of nowhere and it was making people depressed, it just didn't square with me. It wasn't what I was seeing at all. And so I started to question more and more what we were doing, and specifically around the drugs, because then I was thinking, well, okay, maybe even though like morally, I do think it's not a good thing to just drug away symptoms. I kind of take a very old school grandma-like approach for depression and anxiety. Like if you have problems in your life, probably best to not sweep them under the rug and just, assume they go away. That doesn't usually make sense. But let's say, hypothetical world, I'm okay with that, and it just like works, and that's just, live and let live. If you want to deal with your problems in that way, then you can. But even when I conceded that point, I was just like, it just doesn't work. You put people on the medications, and then 6 months later, you have to bump the dose. And then, within 2 to 3 years, the person is maxed out on the drug. And I was seeing just classical tolerance going on that you would see with, alcohol or, opiates or anything like that, where the brain just kind of adapts to it. I mean, we have a finely tuned physiology. Our neurotransmitters are involved in how the body functions, the way our heart beats and the way our digestive system works and all of that. And when we disrupt these systems with drugs, it fights against that, and we downregulate receptors and we produce less serotonin and things like that. And I was just seeing that real time. And so I wouldn't see like, hey, take the 50 of Zoloft or the 5 of Lexapro or whatever other SSRI you're on, and the person just kind of sailed off into the distance and they lived a happy life,
Like the commercials, yeah.
No, not at all. And so they would just be back, and eventually they're maxed out on the drug, and they would say two things. They would say, I don't even know what it's doing, was really common. Or they would start to say things like, it's just hardly having an effect. And typically at that time, the person, they just stay on the medication and it's not really that helpful and their life is not going that great. Or we start to stack drugs on them. And then we, more and more and more. And so I would start saying things to my attendings. I'm just like, well, this doesn't really seem like a good long-term solution. The drugs are wearing off. The patient's not getting better. And they would say, well, Josef, there's this thing called treatment-resistant depression, or, maybe they have like an adverse reaction and they start looking a bit manic. They'll say, well, actually, that it was depression originally, but it was actually just undiagnosed bipolar disorder. So they would just start like making up these reasons why the patients weren't getting better, essentially, and all roads lead to blaming it on the person's brain. And then, obviously they would have like another drug for that. And so I'm just like, something seems really off, but every time I bring it up with my attendings, they're always just like, you have to trust the science. These drugs are FDA approved. We've got really great data supporting the usefulness of these drugs. Like we're modern, we've advanced past this kind of Luddite thinking and where you just have to kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We're really treating these medical disorders, and the psychiatric research backs that up. And so I'm like 26 at the time, like I'm a junior doctor. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, I really don't understand what's going on here. And so I decide that I want to specialize in psychiatric clinical trials. I'm just like, something's off about this, but I don't understand epidemiology. I don't understand clinical trial design. And every time I look at these papers and the conclusions, they're saying, the drugs are safe and effective. They're the way to go. Like intuitively, it just doesn't make sense to me. But, all of these guys at Harvard and Stanford and UCLA, whose names are on the paper and they're leading the field, they're saying the other things. So I go, I need to dig in here. So I finished my psychiatric residency, and I go and work for Johnson & Johnson in doing a fellowship in psychiatric drug development. And I work in the pharmaceutical industry in clinical development, kind of bringing drugs to market, and do that for a year. And then I work at the FDA in the division of psychiatry, where I get a very extensive education on the standards for letting drugs onto the market and how we evaluate their effectiveness in the short term, but then also in the long term. And then, and then I go back to the pharmaceutical industry. But in a whole, in those 3 years, what I end up discovering is that we're practicing way outside of the evidence base, and that the research supporting these medications, particularly, honestly, after about like 3 months, is really poor. And so the first thing that I notice is that none of the drugs are studied longer than a year in a controlled trial, which to me, I'm just thinking like, this is ridiculous. I mean, we have drugs that clearly cause tolerance. They wear off over time. And no one ever said, hey, FDA or NIMH or any of these big government institutions that we trust, they never said, hey, we should probably look at what's happening to these people in the long run. And so they don't do that. I also learned that the outcomes, the quote unquote, when these drugs work, it's just symptom scales. So it's like you could numb someone out and the symptom scale is lower. They don't look at real life outcomes. They don't look at how satisfied are you in your relationships? How satisfied are you in your work? Hospitalizations, like concrete data there. They don't look at that. And in fact, we find the opposite a lot of the time. we actually find like more suicide attempts on the people who are given the drugs than who are not given the drugs. And so like even some of the data supporting them is mainly supporting that these drugs are kind of blunting, but they're not really helping people in objective outcomes, maybe even making people worse. And then finally, I end up digging into this this research around psychiatric drug side effects, which has been talked about in the medical literature for a really long time. Things like persistent sexual dysfunction following the SSRIs, tardive dysphoria, which is the SSRI type medications making people very fatigued and also causing brain fog in the long run. Benzodiazepines like Xanax and Klonopin leading to high anxiety, as well as like obsessive intrusive thoughts and agoraphobia. Antipsychotics causing brain, like actual cognitive changes, brain shrinkage, movement disorders. And all of this stuff is like, it's in the medical literature, but I'd never even heard about it before because there wasn't, a big commercial agenda kind of bringing that forward. And so all of these things kind of come together and I'm like, I'm participating in like the biggest fraud of the 21st century. We're putting people on drugs that don't necessarily work. They wear off over time. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that these drugs are actually making people worse because the brain is not designed to be on drugs for like decades at a time. And we've been lying to people. We've been telling them they're safe and effective without saying, oh yeah, for like the less than a year they were studied for. And I mean, that's just the start of this. After this, there's a huge propaganda machine going on. There's this corruption in academia and also in how the news covers this. And it was just this thing that I just kept on digging into. And I was just like, oh, now I see what happens when you have like $1 billion pharmaceutical and essentially use that influence and resource to shape the narrative around these drugs. And so, yeah, that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years.
This is far more. I mean, just after hearing that, this is far more complicated than I actually thought. In my mind, overprescription is one thing, and that's important and complicated. But just the way you laid it out there with the 1 year follow up, I didn't know that. That's crazy. Let me ask you this question. You talked about being in your residence, doing your residency, and sort of having this epiphany about drugs not working, so on and so forth. Why did you decide then to go into the pharmaceutical industry? Was it sort of just to be a man on the inside, or were you interested in being part of making better drugs? What was the motivation there?
So it was a little bit of both. I would say initially my wife was pregnant and I needed a job close to her family, and there was this opportunity that came up to work for them. I had actually wanted to go to the FDA. The original plan after residency was go to the FDA, but the government shut down in 2020 during COVID. And so all of the applications stalled out. And I was like, okay, so where am I going to go? And I go, well, this would be a great thing because I was interested in drug safety. That was like my real passion. I'm going to go to the FDA. I'm going to work underneath Mark Stone. He was the deputy director of safety. During my residency, I'd been emailing him, asking him these questions, and we struck up a professional relationship. So I'm like, I'm going to go work for Mark. That's going to be great. And when the government shut down, I was like, well, it kind of was like that. I'm like, I want to go and see what's happening on the inside. And I can go and work for the biggest pharmaceutical company in the world, Johnson & Johnson and Janssen, which does their pharmaceutical development. And I can just see what that's like because eventually I'm going to go to the FDA and I'm going to regulate that industry. So that's what kind of took me over there.
That's nice because that's kind of sort of the opposite of what you hear with the revolving door between pharmaceutical companies and going in and out of government. That's honorable. I like that.